The National Museum of Funeral History presents The Final Curtain Never Closes. I'm your host, Genevieve Keeney Vasquez, the president and CEO of the museum. Well, I have a really fascinating guest with me today. I'm really excited to dive deep into his subject matter and all that he tends to encompass on talking about the famous who have passed on before us. And so Mike Osborne is with me today. Mike, welcome.
So good to be here. Thank you for inviting me on, Genevieve.
Yeah, it's fascinating. You know, when I read your title, Famous and Gravy, I thought, wow, is that mashed potatoes and gravy? Is that gravy on top of famous people? I didn't get it at first until my executive assistant, she broke it down for me. She said, no, famous and grave. And I was like, oh.
It's buried in there, so to speak.
Yeah.
I've hidden the grave part. And that question comes up a lot. Why gravy? And I have a number of answers for it. But part of it, I think what you're getting at is the concept of the show is about reviewing the lives of dead celebrities. So fame and grave. That's kind of how we got.
Yeah. Well, we always have, we have this amazing exhibit here at the National Museum of Funeral History called Thanks for the Memories. And it really showcases and encompasses famous people, whether they're inventors or movie stars or singers, sports icons. If they were somehow in the famous world that we all know people to be celebrities to be a part of, they're featured within that exhibit. And so it's a pretty fascinating exhibit. And it really speaks to what you are really talking about. And, they have, books out for funerals of the famous. We also sell those in our gift shop as well. And again, they're always creating new editions. But I understand that your Famous and Gravy has basically a timeline that you only go back so far?
That's been the self-imposed rule, is that initially it was people who had died in the last 10 years. We've now stretched that out, so it's anybody who's died in the 21st century. I think part of what we were trying to work with there is people whose memory is still kind of with us, still kind of hovering. One thing I've learned over the course of the show, it's really interesting how fickle fame is and how memory fades for people who I think were, a really big deal. My favorite example of this is Paul Newman. If you ask a boomer about Paul Newman, they'll say, oh, he was the king of Hollywood. If you ask a Gen Xer about Paul Newman, they'll say, oh, yeah, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and maybe Slapshot or, a couple other movies. If you ask a millennial, they'll say, I feel like my dad told me about him. And if you ask a Gen Z, they'll say, you mean the salad dressing guy? So there's all these different memories of fame, and all these different ways in which we do and do not remember famous people. So part of what we were working with was who is kind of still with us in some sense, which is perhaps relevant to your interests in your museum as well.
Yeah, most definitely. We feel the same way. We try to capture, people that are still, they can bring memories back to almost all generations. And we were finding as well that when we were working on that exhibit, that it was important to bring in, the new people that had just recently passed away, because that's what's going to resonate with the current generation, right? Totally. And so, so we always keep it up to date. We always have to keep our ear to what's happening in the world and who has passed away. And, and I have to say, just most recent celebrity death was Charles Cook, right? And my daughter, who apparently was, an avid follower of his, and I didn't even know it. And she was just like, oh, Mom, did you hear? And I was like, who? And not in a bad way. It was just that, I had not been privy to who he was and realized, he had this huge following and this huge footprint in the famous world and what he was trying to accomplish. And so his death had a huge ripple effect. And I think that That's another thing that we do with the exhibit is how did that ripple touch you?
Yeah. Oh, that's very much at the heart of our show. I just have to say I haven't had a chance to visit the exhibit yet. I can't wait. I'm very excited about the opportunity to come to your space soon. But you raise a point there that is very near and dear to my heart, which is sort of the whole idea of celebrity as mirror. That celebrities are sort of amplified, exaggerated versions of very common human qualities. And, one of the philosophies of our show is that we want to turn that mirror back on us. Certain people become famous for a reason. Maybe they're funny, maybe they're beautiful, maybe they're intelligent. And you can get a lot more specific. And I think that they embody key characteristics of culture and of generations. So by turning that lens around, I think it tells us something about ourselves. It tells us something about our cultures, our aspirations, are characteristics that we want to try and develop and improve upon, which is really the whole motivation for the podcast.
Oh, and I think that's a wonderful, concept in which to deliver the podcast and the information that you're hoping that your listeners will take away from it. I think it's phenomenal. I remember, we're sitting here talking about, famous people, and when they pass away, I remember when I was working on the exhibit, the Thanks for the Memories exhibit, and the part that I was working on was the coroner from The Wizard of Oz, and which is the Robbie Meinhardt, who was also the Oscar Mayer Wiener mascot or spokesperson, if you will. Is just one of the Munchkins, and I remember working on that piece, and we were going through all the other stars or characters that played in The Wizard of Oz, and I had a very profound moment where all of a sudden I realized, I was like, wow, these people are actually dead. But I watched Wizard of Oz as a child growing up. Every single year it was on television. It was just an icon, right? We just go to the television, we'd watch it. And television has a way of keeping all of these stars and these characters alive for years beyond their death. And I think that I just hadn't come to that realization yet that the actors and actresses of that show that I had watched for so many years were actually dead, because in my mind, they were still alive, still frozen in time.
Yeah. And I guess that's the way fame works. And maybe it's the way art works to some extent, when something creative is captured and is durable, and sort of stands the test of time. Something like The Wizard of Oz, it has this sort of illusion of permanence, and we think of all the creative minds that must have gone into that project, and that also has that same illusion in some sense. Maybe that's so interesting.
Yeah, it is, and I think that Thanks for the Memories gives way to that, because you guys, because you go into the exhibit and you start looking. Like, I remember I was coming across, we've got all these different memorial folders or memorial cards from the different famous people, and they're featured within this exhibit. And so we kind of took their memorial card, if you will, and kind of expanded on who they were, so you can learn a little bit more about that person. Perhaps maybe some of their contributions to the television or the movie or their invention. And I remember coming across this memorial folder, and I was reading, and I was like, at first I didn't know who he was, because I had to do my research, because there were so many memorial folders. And when I did my research, I was like, what? He was the founder of Doritos, the chip? I was like, what? I have a memorial card? I didn't even know who it was that that it was this person. I was like, we actually have the memorial card of the founder of Doritos. And I apologize, I don't have his name right now on my head, but I just remembered being kind of taken back that it was like, wow, He did have a significance, and his legacy still lives on. I know many listeners right now probably have a bag of chip of Doritos in their pantry right now.
I sure do. You just had me thinking about it. Out of curiosity, if I can ask, I'd love to learn more about how because I think anytime, somebody who works at a museum is making hard decisions about what to put on exhibit. What for that particular space? How did you think about it? Like what? How did you decide who was important to for there to be a display?
I think a lot of it was about what kind of artifacts we were able to pull in that were also representative of that memorial folder. Because sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
we have hundreds of memorial folders, and you're right, not all of them can come out on display. There's just not enough space.
Right.
And
Right.
so I think it was, at the time, and we do update it. We kind of have it revolving. There's some mainstays, but some of them can revolve, especially when we get new people that have passed away. But it was,
Mm-hmm.
like I said, basically one was kind of like I kind of want to say like how many generations would recognize this person, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Perhaps we wouldn't want to put somebody that died in 1920 or 1930s because the people coming to visit the museum now, they don't have that attachment. They don't have the ability to recognize what they're looking at. We kind of want to
Sure.
give some, stuff that's more fresh, where people can be like, oh, I didn't know that was so and so, or oh, that's so and so's memorial folder and stuff like that. If their legacy has stood the test of generations, then they definitely, like Marilyn Monroe. I mean,
Sure.
everyone knows who Marilyn Monroe is still today. And we actually have the crypt front of Marilyn Monroe, the original one.
Mm.
And it still has the original lipstick prints on it and the kind of like the faded look to it. And actually, that's the only exhibit we actually encourage people to touch because her nameplate
Huh.
has to be changed out on a regular basis. Because as people go visit her graveside, her nameplate gets worn down because people are rubbing it.
Oh
And
wow.
so that's how we ended up with the crypt front is when they had to go change out the nameplate, they change out the crypt front as well. So we asked for the donation of the crypt front so that we could showcase it in our exhibits.
Very interesting. At one point in time, in a previous life, I was a geologist and I worked in a
Oh,
paleontology lab. And it was the same lab at the University of Texas where it's all the back end material that the museum exhibitors have to make decisions about what to put on display. So you get to see all this stuff that never makes it, into public view. That question of how to put together an exhibit has always fascinated me.
oh yeah. And here at the museum, when I'm curating, there's not only the information that gets put in, the space that it's allocated for it. Do I have enough space? And then also making sure that the exhibit is doing two things, that it's educating, but at the same time being very respectful for the dead, because you kind of have that balance where you've got to make sure that it's presented in a manner that people can take away some great information. Maybe it's historical information. Maybe it's current information that hopefully one day they could use for themselves when they're planning for their own funeral or a funeral of their loved one. But at the same time, it's not so in your face kind of exhibition or information that kind of leaves you unsettled. It's more of a calming, open armed, conversational kind of layout of our exhibits.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It sounds like there's a balance to strike and a lot of nuance, care, and thought. Yeah.
Oh, most definitely, yeah. Because a lot of times when people like to judge us by our name, right? The National Museum of Funeral History, we are what we are. We do represent death, but we showcase the profession that cares for the dead
Mm-hmm.
first and foremost. Maintain the history of that, because even death becomes us all. It's the greatest equalizer. I don't care if you're famous or you're not famous, if you're rich or you're
Yeah,
poor, death is going to become you.
100%. I mean, I think one thing I can say about the concept of my podcast is I will continue to have plenty of people who I can feature on the show because of that exact certainty. Have you, out of curiosity, ever seen a documentary called Obit? It's really interesting. It's about how they write obituaries, and I highly recommend it. I think it's on
Oh,
Amazon. Yeah, it's sort of behind the scenes for. I think it's at the New York Times. It's the obit writers. It profiles them. And, because a lot of obituaries are pre-written, some are not, and I think my memory of the documentary is that they had they talked to a number of the writers, but they also I think it was Michael Jackson who died unexpectedly. And so you watch them sort of go through the editorial process of writing an obituary. It's fascinating. But I was thinking of it because your comment a moment ago about history. One of the things I remember from that documentary is that they say the obituary is sort of the first pass at writing history, essentially, at writing somebody's history.
And it's interesting you say that because just literally about a week and a half ago, we were writing my mother's obituary. Oh, and wow. We were given a template pretty much. And it asks very specific points. And I remember writing, putting it together with my daughter. And I said, well, make sure we put in this person, because an obituary, like you said, it's a telling of the history of that person's life. But it's also very important in genealogy.
Yes.
When you're trying to figure out who belongs to who came from who, where does that tree branch spread, and what's the root of that tree? And so that's a really important element of an obit. Not just to talk about the person and notify the death of that person, because it was the history of the obituary is the public announcement of the death, right. And now it's really like you said, it's a testament of their existence, tells their history, but it's very important in genealogy for families to know who they're connected with.
Totally. I had a friend who she also had a podcast. Dying Kindness was the name of it, and I haven't checked in with her in a while. I'll have to see if her show's active or not. But she had me do an experiment once where she had me write my own obituary, which I found to be actually a really kind of cathartic and interesting process. I mean, it is, it forces you to ask some real big questions about not just your own legacy, but how important legacy is and how you think you will be remembered and regarded. It was, it's a valuable exercise.
Yeah, and I think that's people think that only the famous people are remembered, but not necessarily. They're just remembered because we keep them alive through the repeats of their shows or the repeats of their music, so they do stay alive and pass on through generations. But I think it's always important for us to know that you don't have to be famous to create your own legacy.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We talk about a second death. Have you ever heard of the second death?
I don't think so.
Yeah, the second death is when the last person who knew you or knows of you has passed away. So now there's nobody in the world left to know who Mike Osborne was.
Yeah, I have heard this concept. I didn't know it was called that, but yeah, and it's inevitable, huh?
Yeah.
I think that it's interesting as that relates to fame. I mean, one thing that has, I mentioned this case about Paul Newman earlier, or the example of Paul Newman earlier. I've been surprised over the course of, because we've done 120 episodes or something like that now, and there people who I think are very, very famous, sometimes I'm surprised when their names are not as common as you might think. It has actually taught me quite a bit about the nature of celebrity overall and how transient that is, and how it's more niche than I would have thought, why a certain person is famous, or our own assumptions about how we think about fame and who we think is famous. And surely everybody knows this person, and that's often not the case.
Yeah, very true. And it's almost like, what is the true definition of famous, right?
Yeah.
What defines famous? Because like you said, you think that everybody knows this person, and you come to realize that not the whole world doesn't know. But you got to understand that, there's a lot of people in the world, and it is really hard for lottie-dottie everybody to know everybody.
Certainly something that's happened on our show too is I personally have a very conflicted relationship around celebrity. Early on, I would hear people say about our show, I'm not that into celebrity culture, and neither am I, not especially. I'm not somebody who picks up, Us Weekly or National Enquirer or anything like that. I'm not watching TMZ. Um, I think that there is something about the phenomenon of celebrity kind of in the abstract, where on one hand, nobody actually wants this. Nobody wants to be famous. The loss of privacy, the loss of your own story, the loss of sense of self sounds awful. At the same time, there is this tendency to valorize, to idolize, to put celebrities on a pedestal and say, "Oh, they're just the most remarkable people that have ever lived or ever existed." So, something we try to do on the show is strike a balance. I mean, it is not meant to be a show that is about celebrity obsession by any stretch of the imagination. If anything, our goal is to humanize and try and take an empathetic approach to imagine how a life story might have felt, all with this idea that in doing that, empathetic imagining, that exercise, that we can turn it back on ourselves and learn something about our own journey and how we understand our own legacy and how we understand, what we really want, what is desirable in life.
Listening to you talking about the celebrities and stuff, and then your title of your podcast being Famous and Gravy, I ponder a question that maybe you can or cannot answer: is there a difference between famous and celebrity?
Oh, that's interesting. Uh,
As I mean,
I,
I think I'm famous to my family.
yeah.
You know?
I guess I have been using the terms interchangeably, and maybe I need to be more careful about that. I think a lot about that Maya Angelou quote that I always butcher, but people may remember what you said. They may not remember, what you did, but they'll always remember how you made them feel.
Mm-hmm.
That
Mm-hmm.
is how it's. I was actually, before we did the episode on Maya Angelou, I don't think I knew that quote, or I hadn't committed it to memory. And it's amazing how often I see that there's people whose names I can't remember, who I run into, and maybe they're famous, maybe not. Maybe I see them on the TV, maybe I see them in real life, but I do remember how they made me feel. And maybe
Yes.
that's an answer to that question about fame versus celebrity, and that how do we regard how somebody made us feel?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, because I often wonder. I'm like, is there a difference? It's kind of like I liken it to the difference between a casket and a coffin, because there is
Mm,
a difference, but they're very similar, right?
yeah.
They're used interchangeably. So
Yes. Yeah.
something to ponder on. So I'd be interesting to see what other people would think about the differences between what makes someone a celebrity versus what makes someone famous, and can
Yeah.
they be both, right?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it before you asked, and I'll have to give it some more consideration. I mean, I think I think something in the answer feels about how I would separate creative work from humanity, perhaps from somebody's inner humanity. Maybe that's part of the answer, but
Yeah.
I'll give it some thought.
Well, hopefully it's got our listeners thinking too, and getting them to ponder on that concept. And I don't want it to be the Webster diction, the Webster's definition by any means. I kind of would really want it to be a person, because if you think about it, people are celebrities and people are famous because of us, because of the followers, because of the people they're entertaining.
Yeah.
So I think it really needs to be a question that comes from there's just the general population that makes these people famous, right?
Hmm.
Because they wouldn't
Hmm.
be famous or celebrities without us.
That's right. No, that's absolutely right. I mean, uh, I'm just sort of riffing on this now, and I
Yeah,
agree
no,
it
it's
shouldn't
great. Go
be
ahead.
a Webster's dictionary definition. But I suppose where my mind goes as I consider it, like celebrity has this. I think it tends to have negative connotations. It feels often like we're flattening a person. We know them for a couple of key accomplishments. We think of red carpets and bright flashing lights and paparazzi, uh,
Mm-hmm.
and and not all of that is honestly unappealing to me. I certainly would never want to be a celebrity in that regard. But I do think that part of the human experience and human journey is about creative expression and tapping into a deep part of ourselves and when I use the word creative, I mean that in the broadest sense. I think you can be a creative, you can be an artist, you can be a creative accountant, you can be a creative parent, you can be a creative, member of a religious organization. I mean, I think of creativity in the biggest, broadest sense. And I think that's whatever else we're doing in life. I feel like we all have the potential to tap into that and to find tools and communities to bring out that inner expression. And that I do want. I don't want the red carpet treatment, but I do want, my inner creativity to find an outlet.
Yeah, and it seems like you have a lot of creativity because you've been on a lot of projects throughout your life, it seems, and you've actually won quite a few awards and recognitions. And so, I mean, out of all of them that you've done thus far, what do you think is your favorite?
So I've created 3 shows, and I've been lucky, original shows that I, dreamed up with friends or with collaborators, and that have all had some success. And I've also worked as a back-end producer and consultant on, dozens of projects at this point. There was an episode of my first podcast, and that first podcast, I'm almost like embarrassed to say the name because it's a real mouthful. It was called Generation Anthropocene, and there was an episode we did called The Sound Tracker that has stuck with me for the last, 12, 13 years since it came out. It was a story about a man who was in graduate school, and he woke up one day, and actually, the way he tells the story, he was on a road trip, and he was driving across Montana, and there was this lightning storm that came about. And so he pulled over his car and he went out into this field and he watched this lightning storm and listened to it. And he had this kind of epiphany where he said, my God, I've never really, truly, deeply listened in my life. And he had this awakening, and he ended up dedicating the rest of his life to building out a sound library where he's traveling all over the world and capturing the sounds of, cultures and of nature and of, geologic events and all kinds of things. And there's a sort of funny twist because he ended up losing his hearing. But he still, and when we went out to interview him, I realized, he had lost his hearing and would not be able to participate in the conversation. And he said, here's what we'll do. You send me your questions and I will bring in sounds from my sound library, and we'll have them be, we'll have this rich bank of content and of sound experiences be, the feature of the show. And he recorded it and he did a little voiceover, and he sent us back just the most beautiful. It was actually 2 hours of audio. We cut it down to about 45 minutes. I think that honestly that I'm very proud of Famous and Gravy. I love talking about dead celebrities and how we understand our lives through the prism of, celebrity biographies. But I think for me that episode, the Soundtracker episode, still feels like a high watermark. Still feels like maybe the greatest thing I was ever a part of. And when I say a part of, I played a small part. I created the show that made that episode possible. My contribution was ultimately very small, but it is a beautiful piece of audio, and I'm very proud of it.
Wow, I definitely want to listen. Is it still accessible?
It's still out there, yeah. If you just Google, unfortunately, like I said, the title of the podcast is a real mouthful, Generation Anthropocene, but the Soundtracker, it's worth a listen. And it's one of those pieces where it's best, if you give it your full attention. You don't want to kind of listen to it on a commute as much. It's more, on a rainy night with candles or something. It makes for a good immersive listen.
Oh, wow. And I think that, I think people are always now, because we have so much access to so much information, you never know where to turn. Um, Sometimes I think it's nice to give somebody something to focus on, to just take a pause, reflect on not only, someone else's life and the profoundness within it, but how that can affect your own life. And, that's one of the things at the museum here that we try to accomplish as well is to get you to embrace life, realize that life is finite, that we aren't going to live forever, and live a fuller life, because death is going to become us all, and perhaps maybe that podcast could shed some of put somebody a little bit more in touch with their own inner feelings and emotions, and learn to be, like you said, a better listener in life, right?
And that last point is the key for me. Before working on that episode, I'd never really thought about what deep listening is and what it means, and the muscle memory in the mind and the life skill that it is. And the joke I sometimes make is I got into podcasting because I love to talk, and I can fill time. I can stay on microphone all day long. But much to my chagrin, I've discovered that the art of being a great audio storyteller is actually about listening. It's about really locking in on what somebody's saying, the nuances of the human voice, the what it means to connect.
Definitely. I mean, when I started doing my podcasting myself, I'm going into my third year of podcasting, and you're right. It's all about connecting. And for me, I always tell my interviewees, the people that I'm going to interview, is that keep it organic, right? I don't want to have a script. I don't want to make this feel like an interview. I want this to be a conversation. In order for us to have this conversation, we have to listen to each other, right? Because we don't know what's coming up next. In order to be able to give our feedback to what you're talking about, or to create a concept that you basically, in your conversation, you created a thought in my mind, which now we can, expand on. So I think that's great.
I'll offer some real-time feedback. I had no idea our conversation was going to go in this direction. And I'm really glad to have really considered the difference between celebrity and fame. And I'm very glad to be reminded of the Soundtracker episode. It's been a while since I've thought of that. And I love that. I love a conversation as opposed to, an interview or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, obviously we want to hit our highlight points, right? To get people intrigued and understanding who the audience is, or, who the people are that they're listening to, right? What is our background? Who are we? But give them also content that not only is entertaining for them to listen to, but perhaps thought provoking. So while they're listening, they're like, I never thought about that. There really is perhaps a difference. So I'm curious, you've got all these accomplishments, you've got your podcasting. So do you consider yourself famous?
I don't. And I don't know. I don't think I am really by any measure, probably, but I obviously don't know that I can be objective about that question. I think that I care a lot about community, and I think about reputation and what my story communicates to people. And I think one of the things I really care about, I'm very, very passionate about podcasting. And one of the themes that I think is present on Famous and Gravy, but is also present, I hope in my journey as a producer and consultant, is that it's really worth trying and experimenting. That I've created these 3 shows that have all attracted major media distribution, that have led to some awards and some things that I can puff up my chest about. But what I care about with the people I'm in community with is the idea that we're all working to fulfill our dreams on some level. Whether or not we actually do fulfill them is not the point. The point is to try. And I would like to think that my reputation communicates that the story of starting a show without any pre-existing audience and with very little experience in storytelling before that, you know, maybe people read into that possibilities for what they might be able to do with whatever their creativity may be.
Well, I think we all have our own level of famous in our circle of people who know us, and how we put ourselves out there and become an impression towards other people, right? Like you said, it's how they make us feel, right? So perhaps that you have left a lot of great feelings behind. So I would challenge you maybe to record one of your own famous engravies about yourself that can be played for you posthumously.
Oh, wow. I will say I have thought about that. I have not, since starting the show and developing the concept, I cannot say that I've experienced many deaths in my life, in my inner circle, or even in my outer circle. But I have thought about applying our approach to people in my life. What would we start off every episode, for example, by grading the first line of the obituary on a scale of 1 to 10. We evaluate the language and how the story is characterized in the media. I wouldn't want to deconstruct anybody else's obituary too much, but the next category is actually probably more on point. It's 5 things I love about you. It's things that we love about a celebrity that we may not have recognized, before, or paid attention to before, or valued when they were alive. One of the questions we've asked ourselves, on the show overall is what kind of conversations become available after somebody's passed and after there's been a period of grieving. So I mentioned earlier, we don't do any celebrity deaths after the year 2000. We also always wait a year after somebody's passed before doing an episode. It's sort of allowing for some grief. And I do think that there is a certain kind of conversation that opens up after a period of grieving, collectively, which is sort of what we do with celebrity deaths.
So who are you having these conversations with when you're featuring a certain celebrity or a famous person?
Yeah, so for the bulk of the show, it was my co-host Amit, who's stepped away recently, and now it's become close friends, and mostly close friends, I would say. But the whole approach of the show is friendship is very centered. That it's almost like a book report in a way, or actually more like a book club. That's a better way of putting it. I mean, one of the ways I sometimes think about the concept of the show is that celebrity lives are very well documented. There's often books and documentaries and, YouTube channels and archived interviews and all that. So there's just a lot of publicly available material. And it's almost like we've all read that book. And now we're debriefing on how do we understand that book. What is think about them almost as fictional characters in a novel, except they happen to have been real people, right?
Right.
I don't know if that makes sense, but
no, it totally makes sense. Yeah, there's a show on it's Reels and Famous, and they do the autopsies of the famous people, and their whole. They kind of like their catch line is these were real people too. And so the whole premises of the program through their autopsy is to get you to see that they were real people, that, we know them for their fame, but let's get to know who they really were.
Yeah. And certainly that's what our listeners tell us about the experience of listening to our show, is that I said earlier, we often flatten people, flatten celebrities. We simplify their stories. We take a few things that we know them for, and we fill in the rest. We extrapolate out. And so on our show, I think that there is a richer, deeper, consideration of who a person was. But again, all of it is meant to turn it back on us. I mean, if we go back to that analogy of it's like being in a book club and it's as if we've all read this book, there are themes present. There are key decision points. There are pain points. There's compromises, all of which I think if we turn the stories back on ourselves, allow us to evaluate our own desires, fears, aspirations, legacies to some extent. And that's essentially the gist of the show. So each conversation, each episode, there's two people. It's me and somebody else. And I try to select people who I know are good on a podcast, but also who have a kind of angle in some sort of pre-existing relationship with whatever dead celebrity we're talking about, a novel interpretation, a kind of original argument to make about that life. And then we compare notes throughout the course of the conversation. And then ultimately every episode ends with this category where we say, would you want that life? Which is not meant to be I'm going to change places with somebody. It's meant to be a thought experiment for, what's really enviable and desirable here now that we've had a look at it in this way.
You hit on so many amazing points, and you brought up so many questions. I wish we had more time so that I could ask more of them, but I really hope that, listeners can, really kind of gauge what they feel makes somebody famous versus what makes them a celebrity. And I hope that everybody who's listening feels some type of fame within themselves, because we all should be lucky enough to leave a legacy and show that we actually existed on this earth and we had a life that we lived, and it is worth remembering.
I think that's very well said. Something I think about a lot is the way that we can mistake attention for love sometimes. And,
very true.
Fame is often about trying to be attention seeking. And if we are more aware of how we experience love, then I think a lot of other questions get answered. So thank you for inviting me on, Genevieve. This is wonderful to talk with you.
Yes, thank you so much. I look forward to listening to your podcasts, Famous and Gravy. Thank you again, Mike, for being my guest. And hopefully, once you visit the museum, I'd love to have you back and get your feedback on the exhibit.
Wonderful. Can't wait to pay a visit.
Thank you for joining me today on this podcast, and I hope that you will share this episode with family and friends. We look forward to any feedback you have to offer by giving us a review on Apple or Spotify. And always remember, any day above ground is a good one.